On a humid Maryland night, long before he became one of America's greatest voices of freedom, a young enslaved boy named Frederick hid in the corner of a dark kitchen cabin, trembling. Through a small crack in the boards, he watched his Aunt Hester bound to a beam, her wrists tied above her head. Her crime was simple. She had gone out without permission. The punishment, however, was anything but simple. Captain Anthony, their master, stood behind her with a thick cowskin whip in his hand. What happened next would scar Frederick's memory forever. Every scream, every strike, every drop of blood carved into him the truth he had been too young to understand. Slavery was not just labor, it was terror. Years later, Frederick Douglass would write that this moment, this single night, was the bloodstained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery. And that gate, once opened, would lead him on a journey that the world would never forget. Frederick Douglass was born in February 1818 on the eastern shore of Maryland, a quiet, rural region where plantations stretched along the waterways and where the institution of slavery shaped every aspect of life. Like most enslaved children, he never knew the exact day of his birth. Later in life, he would write that being denied a birthday was the earliest sign that he was seen not as a person but as property. From the moment he entered the world, he belonged to someone else. His mother, Harriet Bailey, worked on a nearby plantation, 12 miles away. Because of the customs of Maryland slavery, mothers and children were usually separated early in life, sometimes within days. In Frederick's case, the separation happened so soon that he could barely remember her face. She traveled to see him only at night, walking the 12 miles after a full day of labor, lying beside him in the darkness, and leaving again before dawn. Frederick later wrote that although he felt her presence, he never once saw her in daylight. Her visits were brief, quiet, and filled with the grief of knowing she could not stay. When she died, he was not permitted to attend her burial. Frederick spent his early years with his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, an elderly woman known for raising many of the enslaved children born into the Bailey family. She lived in a small cabin on the edge of the large Lloyd estate, one of the most powerful and wealthy plantations in the region. Colonel Edward Lloyd owned hundreds of enslaved workers, dozens of overseers, and vast fields that stretched farther than Frederick could see. The plantation was a world unto itself, governed by strict rules, harsh punishments, and the absolute authority of those who claimed ownership over others. When Frederick was about 7 years old, his grandmother led him by the hand to the main plantation house. She told him they were simply visiting. He believed her, trusting the only constant figure in his young life. But when the sun began to set, she quietly left. Frederick watched her walk down the dirt road as slowly becoming smaller, then disappearing entirely. He called for her, confused and afraid, but she did not return. She was not allowed to. Her task had been completed. She delivered him to the master. Frederick later described that moment as one of the most painful of his childhood. In that single afternoon, he learned what slavery truly meant: a separation without explanation, loss without comfort, and obedience without choice. He was placed under the authority of Captain Anthony, the overseer, and his first master. Anthony was responsible for managing Colonel Lloyd's vast property. Although not as wealthy as Lloyd, he wielded enormous power over the enslaved people assigned to him. He was regarded as harsh, irritable, and often cruel. Frederick quickly learned that his daily life depended on Anthony's moods, commands, and punishments. The plantation's routines were rigid. Food was rationed. Clothing was minimal. Enslaved children received almost nothing, only a simple linen shirt that served as their entire wardrobe. They slept on cold floors with no blankets, even during the winter months. For the young, tasks included carrying water, running errands, tending animals, and staying out of the way of the adults whose authority defined their existence. Even small mistakes could result in severe punishments. The event that marked Frederick's understanding of slavery more deeply than any other occurred when he witnessed the brutal whipping of his Aunt Hester. She was a young woman of striking beauty, admired by the enslaved men, and closely watched, often obsessively, by the white overseers. Captain Anthony harbored jealousy and suspicion when she spent time with a man named Ned Roberts. One night, when she returned later than expected, she was dragged into the kitchen, tied with her hands above her head, and whipped repeatedly. According to Frederick, her screams filled the room, and blood streamed down her back. He hid behind a doorway, watching through a small crack, frozen with fear. That moment, he later wrote, was the blood-stained gate that revealed to him the full horror of slavery. Life on the plantation continued under the constant threat of violence. Overseers enforced discipline with whips, clubs, and threats of further punishment. Among them was Mr. Plummer, a man whom Frederick described as a drunkard and a savage monster. His cruelty was so extreme that even Captain Anthony occasionally reprimanded him. But reprimands rarely meant improvement. The enslaved people learned quickly that protection was uncertain, justice non-existent, and mercy unreliable. Despite the harshness around him, Frederick demonstrated early signs of intelligence, curiosity, and resilience. He listened closely to conversations, observed the behavior of overseers and slaves, and began forming quiet judgments about the world he lived in. Even as a child, he sensed the difference between the enslaved and the free, between those who commanded and those who obeyed. He especially noticed that white children could read and write, while enslaved children could not. The ability to read seemed to grant power, confidence, and self-respect. Frederick realized that literacy separated freedom from bondage. Education, however, was forbidden. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in many parts of the South and considered dangerous everywhere. Slaveholders believed that literacy encouraged rebellion, escape, and defiance. As long as enslaved people remained ignorant, they remained controllable. Literacy was a threat, a path toward questioning the world around them. Yet fate intervened in a way Frederick could not have predicted. In 1826, when he was about 8 years old, he received news that he would be sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, the relatives of Captain Anthony's son-in-law. The reason was unclear. Perhaps he appeared bright or capable of domestic work. Perhaps the Aulds simply needed a child servant. Regardless of the intent, the result would shape the course of his entire life. As the wagon carried him toward Baltimore, Frederick felt a mixture of fear and wonder. Leaving the plantation meant stepping into the unknown. But when he arrived in the city, his world expanded instantly. The streets were filled with activity. Ships lined the harbor. Merchants called out to customers. And most shocking to him, free black people moved openly through the streets, working, trading, and living lives that appeared entirely different from anything he had ever imagined. His new mistress, Sophia Auld, welcomed him with kindness. She had never owned a slave before and treated Frederick with a warmth he had never known from a white person. She smiled at him, spoke softly, and even began teaching him the alphabet. Her instruction was gentle and patient. Each letter she taught him opened a door that slavery tried desperately to keep closed. But when Hugh Auld discovered what she was doing, everything changed. He demanded that she stop immediately. He declared that teaching a slave to read would forever unfit him to be a slave. In his anger, he revealed something more powerful than he intended. He explained the system. Slaves were kept ignorant so they could remain obedient. Knowledge would make them unmanageable. Frederick listened carefully. In that moment, he realized that literacy was the path to freedom. If education unfit him for slavery, then he would pursue it at any cost. Hugh Auld had not merely forbidden learning, he had exposed its power. From that day forward, Frederick's desire to read became an unshakable mission. Baltimore, with its energy, diversity, and possibilities, became the beginning of his transformation. He was still enslaved, but something had changed. He had taken the first step from silent submission to quiet resistance, and the path ahead, though dangerous, was now illuminated by knowledge. This was the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead him far beyond Maryland, far beyond the reach of the men who claimed to own him, and into the history books of a nation he would one day help reshape. When Frederick Douglass arrived in Baltimore, he entered a world unlike anything he had ever known. The city was loud, crowded, and alive, a sharp contrast to the isolated, rural fields of the eastern shore. Ships creaked against the harbor docks, their sails flapping in the wind. Street vendors called out prices for fish, vegetables, and baked goods. Carriages rolled over cobblestones, and the smell of smoke drifted from the chimneys of brick houses packed tightly along the narrow streets. To a young boy who had known nothing but plantation life, it felt like stepping into another universe. At the home of Hugh and Sophia Auld, Frederick began to experience a form of life that was still slavery, yet different in important ways. He lived indoors instead of in a drafty cabin. He wore cleaner clothes. He moved through the city streets while running errands. Most importantly, he was spoken to not always kindly, but sometimes with a tone that acknowledged his presence as a human being. These early impressions would become the foundation of his awakening. Sophia Auld, his new mistress, greeted him with a softness that stunned him. Her voice was gentle. Her eyes were kind. She had never owned a slave before, and did not yet understand how the institution demanded that she act. When she began teaching him the alphabet, it was with the innocence of someone who simply wished to help a child learn. Each letter she showed him A, B, C felt like a small door opening. And Frederick, young as he was, sensed immediately that this knowledge held power. Her lessons continued until the afternoon, when Hugh discovered them. He reacted instantly and sharply. He ordered her to stop. He insisted that teaching a slave to read was dangerous, both to the slave and to the slaveholder. Literacy, he said, would make Frederick unmanageable and discontented. A slave who could read would no longer accept his status. He would begin to think. He would question. He would rebel. Frederick never forgot that moment. Hugh Auld's angry words revealed the truth of slavery more clearly than any beating or threat. Knowledge was the line between bondage and freedom. Ignorance was the tool that kept the system alive. If reading was forbidden, then reading must also be powerful. From that day forward, Frederick understood his mission. He would learn quietly, secretly, and with determination so strong that no law or threat could break it. He began by observing white children on the streets of Baltimore. Many of them were poor, working-class boys who had little more than the clothes on their backs. Yet they could read. They could write. Some of them, curious about Frederick, taught him small lessons in exchange for bread. He later joked that he became literally bred for knowledge. He learned letters in alleys, copied words scratched onto pieces of wood, and practiced forming sentences whenever he could find a scrap of paper. Through these secret lessons, Frederick learned more than reading. He learned how words shaped thought. He discovered newspapers. He read signs, labels, and discarded pages of books. He began to understand ideas of freedom, justice, human rights that were unimaginable on the plantation. And with understanding came something even more dangerous: awareness. He realized, for the first time, the full injustice of his condition. He understood that slavery was not natural or inevitable but imposed. He saw how one group held power over another, and how literacy exposed the lies that slaveholders told about the supposed inferiority of the enslaved. This realization filled him with both hope and deep sorrow. Hope, because education showed him a way forward. Sorrow, because he now felt the weight of his chains more heavily than ever before. Frederick's relationship with Sophia Auld also changed. Once kind and gentle, she began to transform under the influence of her husband and the expectations of slave society. She stopped smiling at Frederick. She stopped teaching him. She became strict, cold, and watchful. Slavery, as Douglass later wrote, was as destructive to the soul of the slaveholder as it was to the slave. The institution demanded cruelty, suspicion, and dominance, and those who owned slaves often changed to fit those demands. Yet Frederick did not give up. The spark had already been lit. He continued learning in secret, often hiding books in his clothing or studying behind closed doors. Among the texts he read was the Columbian Orator, a book filled with speeches about freedom, moral courage, and the rights of individuals. One dialogue in the book between a master and a slave struck him deeply. In it, the slave argued so powerfully for his freedom that the master was eventually persuaded to set him free. Though fictional, this conversation strengthened Frederick's belief that argument, reason, and truth were weapons just as powerful as physical resistance. As he grew older, Frederick began to study the movements of ships in the harbor. He watched as vessels sailed north to free states and imagined himself aboard one. He memorized the names of the streets and the routes that led to the docks. Baltimore's closeness to the water awakened in him not only curiosity but strategy. The idea of escape, once only a distant dream, now began to feel possible. But with awareness came anger. The more Frederick learned, the more he understood the depth of his oppression. Literacy sharpened his sense of injustice. It made the chains heavier because he could now see the world that existed beyond them. There were moments when he regretted learning at all, moments when the knowledge of his condition felt unbearable. But even in those moments, he recognized that he had crossed a line. He could no longer be content with ignorance. He could no longer accept his place. The city, with all its noise and movement, became both his teacher and his tormentor. It showed him freedom and denied it at the same time. It inspired him and punished him. But most importantly, it prepared him. The lessons he learned in Baltimore of literacy, observation, reasoning, and quiet resistance would follow him for the rest of his life. By the time Frederick Douglass reached adolescence, he was no longer the uncertain boy who arrived at the Auld household. He was inwardly transformed to a young man with a growing sense of identity, purpose, and possibility. He understood the nature of slavery, the value of education, and the danger of ambition. And although the road ahead would lead through violence, confrontation, and near death, he had already taken the first essential step toward freedom. He had awakened. By the time Frederick reached his mid-teens, the relative stability he experienced in Baltimore came to an abrupt end. A series of family disputes within the Auld household triggered major changes. When his first master, Captain Anthony, died, his estate, including the people he owned, had to be divided among his heirs. Frederick was recalled from Baltimore and sent back to the Eastern Shore to be valued along with the other enslaved people. This return would mark the beginning of some of the harshest years of his life. When he stepped back onto the plantation, Frederick realized how much he had changed and how dangerous that change would be. He no longer accepted his condition quietly. His mind had been awakened by literacy, reason, and a sense of injustice. The plantation, however, had not changed at all. It was still ruled by violence, fear, and the authority of slaveholders who expected absolute obedience. The contrast between these two worlds created a tension that soon erupted. After the estate was divided, Frederick was not returned to Baltimore. Instead, he was assigned to Thomas Auld, the brother of his Baltimore master. Thomas had recently inherited several enslaved people but had little understanding of how to manage them. He was not naturally cruel, but he was insecure and harsh when he felt challenged. He believed that authority must be maintained through punishment. This insecurity made him unpredictable, and Frederick quickly learned that defiance, even silent defiance, would not be tolerated. Life in Thomas Auld's household was harsher than anything Frederick had known in Baltimore. Food was scarce. Clothing was worn thin. Discipline was strict. But the greatest challenge was not physical hardship, it was spiritual deprivation. Thomas was newly religious and used faith as a shield for his behavior. He attended church regularly, prayed loudly, and quoted scripture to justify cruelty. Frederick later wrote that the religion of the South often made slaveholders more vicious, not less. They used the Bible to excuse their actions, claiming divine support for domination. It was during this time that Frederick began to feel the full weight of his rebellious spirit. He refused to be broken, yet he also knew that open resistance would lead to severe punishment. His internal conflict grew heavier each day. He wanted freedom, dignity, and self-respect, but the world around him demanded submission. This tension finally reached a breaking point when Thomas decided that Frederick needed discipline and sent him to live with a man known across the region for his brutality, Edward Covey. Covey was a poor farmer who specialized in breaking young enslaved men. Slaveholders who felt they were losing control would send their slaves to Covey for a year. During that time, Covey used constant labor, harsh punishment, and psychological manipulation to destroy a person's will. His reputation was so feared that enslaved people called his farm the House of Torment. For Frederick, this transfer felt like a death sentence. On his first day at Covey's farm, he was introduced to the relentless pace of work. From dawn until late evening, he labored in the fields, cutting wheat, hoeing corn, carrying heavy logs, and performing any task Covey demanded. Covey rarely gave direct orders. Instead, he hid behind fences, bushes, and barns, watching silently like a hunter stalking prey. His sudden appearances were meant to shock and intimidate. Frederick soon realized that he was being conditioned to live in constant fear. Covey's methods were not limited to physical labor. He used humiliation as a tool. He cursed loudly, criticized constantly, and beat any enslaved person who moved too slowly, spoke too softly, or appeared tired. His violence was unpredictable, sometimes impulsive, sometimes calculated. He wanted to break the mind, not just the body. Frederick later wrote that Covey's power came from his deceitful cunning rather than his strength. Within weeks, Frederick felt himself changing. His hope dimmed. His confidence wavered. His desire for freedom began to weaken under the weight of exhaustion. He described this period as the darkest time of his life, a time when his spirit was nearly crushed. But even in this darkness, small sparks remained. One afternoon, while working in the fields, Frederick saw ships sailing along the Chesapeake Bay. Their white sails caught the wind and glided freely across the water. The sight overwhelmed him. He imagined the sailors aboard the ships, moving from place to place without fear or restraint. He envied their freedom so deeply that it felt like a physical pain. In a moment of despair, he said to himself, "You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave." It was one of the few times in his life when he considered giving up hope entirely. The breaking point came later that year. One hot summer morning, after working for hours in the fields, Frederick collapsed from heat exhaustion. Covey approached, shouting that he was faking. When Frederick did not rise quickly enough, Covey kicked him, struck him, and drove him toward the barn. There, he whipped him repeatedly. Frederick dragged himself away and walked several miles to appeal to Thomas Auld for protection, but Auld refused to intervene. He ordered Frederick to return to Covey's farm immediately. The message was clear: he was alone. When Frederick returned, he expected to be beaten again. But instead, Covey attempted something worse: to break him psychologically. Frederick realized that if he submitted now, he would lose not only his freedom, but his identity. The next confrontation would define him. A few days later, Covey attempted to tie him up for another whipping. But this time, Frederick resisted. He grabbed Covey, held him tightly, and refused to let go. The two struggled violently for nearly 2 hours, Covey shouting, Frederick refusing to relent. Covey called for help, but none of the other enslaved men came. At last, exhausted and humiliated, Covey gave up. Frederick knew he could still be punished later, but something had changed. In that moment, he reclaimed his dignity. Covey never whipped him again. The struggle, Frederick later wrote, was the turning point in my life as a slave. He realized that he could resist, that he could fight, and that he could survive. From that day forward, he was enslaved in body, but never again in spirit. The fight with Edward Covey marked a turning point in Frederick Douglass' life, not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Although he remained enslaved, something within him had changed forever. He had faced the man whose name terrified an entire region, and he had refused to be broken. Covey's whip could no longer reach his spirit, and that realization altered the course of Frederick's future. In later years, Douglass would write that the battle with Covey rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom. Before that fight, he had felt his hope slipping away under the weight of violent labor, hunger, fear, and exhaustion. After it, he felt alive again, dangerously alive. He began to imagine freedom not as a distant dream, but as an achievable reality. His mind, once fogged by despair, grew sharp and determined. Yet Frederick knew there was danger in showing confidence openly. Slaveholders feared nothing more than a slave who walked with purpose. An enslaved person who carried himself proudly, who looked others in the eye, or who spoke with clarity risked punishment. It was safer to appear obedient, even when rebellion burned silently within. And so, Frederick learned the balance that would define the next years of his life. Outward compliance paired with inner resistance. After the year at Covey's farm ended, Frederick was not sent back to Baltimore as he had hoped. Instead, he was hired out to another farmer named William Freeland. Compared to Covey, Freeland was a fair and straightforward man. He believed in discipline, but not cruelty. His rules were clear, his punishments rare, and his expectations consistent. For the first time in a long time, Frederick felt that he could breathe. Freeland allowed the enslaved workers under him to maintain some personal dignity, and that dignity became fertile ground for Frederick's growing leadership. He began teaching other enslaved men to read, quietly at first, then more openly. Each Sunday, when they were free from field labor, Frederick gathered a group of more than 40 young enslaved men and taught them the alphabet, simple words, and passages from the New Testament. The school met secretly in a small, abandoned hut. To the men he taught, literacy was a revelation. It opened their minds and made them question everything. Freeland, though tolerant, knew nothing about these lessons. If he had known, he might have stopped them. But the greatest danger did not come from slaveholders, it came from poor white men who lived nearby. When they discovered what Frederick was doing, they saw it as a threat to the social order. One Sunday, armed with clubs and stones, they stormed the hut and scattered the class. Though no one was killed, the attack made future lessons impossible. Still, Frederick saw the experience not as a defeat, but as proof of the power of education. Literacy frightened those who wanted slavery to remain intact. And anything that frightened oppressors was worth pursuing. During his time with Freeland, Frederick's dream of escape grew stronger. Each day he studied maps, the direction of rivers, and the routes taken by ships. He observed the behavior of slave catchers. He listened to rumors of escapes, successful and failed. He calculated distances, danger zones, and possible allies. His mind became a constant engine of planning. In 1835, he decided that escape was no longer a future hope, but a present necessity. He shared his plan only with the closest men in his literacy group or men he trusted with his life. The plan was bold. They would escape together, traveling north by canoe across the Chesapeake Bay. The risks were enormous. If caught, they could be whipped, tortured, or even killed. But the alternative, a lifetime in chains, felt worse. The escape was set for early spring. The group prepared forged travel passes, written in neat handwriting by Frederick himself. The passes claimed they were traveling to a nearby farm for work. With these papers, they hoped to avoid suspicion long enough to reach the water. But days before the escape, disaster struck. Someone betrayed them. Who it was, Frederick never learned. What he knew was that one morning, the group was suddenly surrounded by armed men. The slaveholders had been informed of the plan. Frederick and his companions were tied, searched, and interrogated. Their passes were found. Their courage was mocked. One slaveholder said coldly, "We will teach you how to run away." Frederick expected to be taken to jail, or worse. Instead, the plan collapsed in a way more humiliating than violent. The men were separated. Some were sent back to their owners. Others were hired out to different farms. Frederick himself was taken to jail in Easton, a dark, filthy place where hope felt distant again. For 2 weeks he sat in his cell, hearing the shouts and moans of other prisoners. The uncertainty of his future pressed heavily on him. He did not know whether he would be sold, beaten, or returned to Baltimore. He did not know whether he would ever see the men from his escape group again. But even in the deepest moments of despair, he carried one conviction. He would eventually be free. Nothing, not even betrayal, could extinguish that belief. Finally, after weeks of waiting, Frederick received unexpected news. Thomas Auld had decided not to sell him to the Deep South, a fate far worse than death in Frederick's eyes. Instead, Thomas sent word that Frederick would be hired out once more, this time to a shipbuilder in Baltimore named William Gardner. When Frederick heard he was returning to Baltimore, even as a slave, he felt a spark of hope. Gardner's shipyard was a dangerous and chaotic place. Men shouted constantly, tools clanged against metal, and the smell of tar and salt water filled the air. Frederick worked alongside free black men, Irish immigrants, and enslaved laborers. The tasks were exhausting, but the work environment held something valuable: opportunity. Frederick observed the skills of ship carpenters, caulkers, and sailors. He absorbed everything. He learned the techniques of caulking, a trade that paid well and allowed black men, free or enslaved, to earn wages. But not all in the shipyard welcomed him. Many white workers, especially Irish laborers, feared competition. They believed that if enslaved or free black workers learned valuable trades, whites might lose jobs. Their prejudice soon turned violent. One afternoon, a group of white workers surrounded Frederick, insulted him, and attacked him. They beat him with fists, stones, and heavy tools. He fell repeatedly, unable to defend himself. When he cried for help, no one intervened. The attack only ended when the men grew tired. Frederick staggered home, bloodied and nearly unconscious. Hugh Auld was outraged, and not because Frederick had been hurt, but because the attackers threatened his property. Hugh went to the authorities, but no charges were filed. No white man would be punished for attacking a black man, enslaved or free. The assault revealed another dimension of Frederick's world. Even skilled labor could not protect him from the hatred of those determined to maintain racial hierarchy. After the attack, Hugh arranged for Frederick to work at a different shipyard, owned by Walter Price. Price treated Frederick fairly, paid him wages which Frederick was required to turn over to Hugh each week, and allowed him to develop his skills as a caulker. Over time, Frederick became one of the most skilled workers in the yard. He was trusted to work independently and to train younger men. His hands grew strong, his confidence returned, and his sense of possibility deepened. In Baltimore, Frederick earned something he had never possessed before: money. Although he was required to give most of it to Hugh, he learned how to negotiate small privileges. He began to keep tiny portions for himself, coins hidden in pockets, saved quietly over months. Each coin represented a step toward his future, a small piece of his ultimate goal. The dream of escape, once nearly realized and then shattered, now returned with fresh urgency. He knew he could not risk another group attempt. He knew he could trust no one but himself. He also understood something new. His skills as a caulker could help him build a life once he reached freedom. He was no longer a desperate boy running blindly. He was a skilled young man with a plan. With each passing week, his dream grew sharper. Freedom was calling, and this time, he would answer. By the year 1838, Frederick Douglass stood on the edge of something powerful and dangerous. He was 20 years old, strong in body, sharpened in mind, and quietly gathering the skills and confidence that would one day make him a leader. But he was still enslaved. Every step he took, every job he held, every coin he earned, was shadowed by the knowledge that he belonged to someone else. Freedom was no longer simply a dream. It was an urgent necessity. The question that consumed him day and night was no longer if he would escape, but how? His time working as a caulker in Baltimore had changed him profoundly. He stood shoulder to shoulder with free men, learned a respected trade, earned wages, and negotiated his place among skilled workers. These experiences gave him glimpses of the life he deserved, a life where his labor belonged to him, not to a master. But the law did not care about skill, merit, or humanity. To the law, he was still property. Every Saturday evening, when he brought his wages to Hugh Ault, he handed over the money with a bitterness he could not hide. He had earned it by his own hands, yet it was claimed by someone who had never swung a hammer or sealed a ship seam. On rare occasions, Hugh allowed Frederick to keep a small portion for himself, but this privilege was inconsistent and could be revoked without warning. Douglass wrote later that these moments taught him the injustice of slavery more deeply than anything before. When a man earns money but cannot claim it as his own, the truth of his bondage becomes painfully clear. Still, the system created cracks, so tiny openings through which a determined man might slip. And Frederick was determined. His skills as a caulker meant he was valuable. His time in the shipyards gave him knowledge of routes, vessels, and sailors. He understood the geography of the Chesapeake Bay, the schedules of ferries, and the movements of cargo ships. Baltimore, with all its noise and chaos, had become a map of possibilities. But he needed more than knowledge. He needed allies, specifically free black sailors who possessed the one thing he lacked: a sailor's protection pass. These passes, also called Seamen's Protection Certificates, were official documents carried by free black sailors in the United States. They identified the bearer as a citizen and protected him from being kidnapped and sold into slavery. For a black man, this document was priceless. With such a pass, Frederick could travel by ship or train without immediately being suspected of escape. It did not guarantee freedom, but it provided a powerful shield when he desperately needed. Frederick spent months studying the passes he saw in the shipyard. He memorized their appearance, their language, even their handwriting styles. He watched free sailors sign their names and learned how the official signatures were written. He practiced copying letters until his hand moved naturally. This skill, combined with his literacy, became the foundation of his final escape plan. But obtaining a pass legally was impossible. He would need help, and help came from someone who believed in him deeply: Anna Murray. Anna was a free black woman living in Baltimore. She was hardworking, independent, and determined. She saved her wages carefully, hoping to build a better future. When she met Frederick, she recognized both his intelligence and his hunger for freedom. Their bond grew quickly, grounded in shared hopes and mutual trust. She believed that he could escape her, and she believed that she could help him. Anna's support became essential. She provided money, clothing, and emotional strength during the most dangerous days of his preparation. Frederick understood that the promise of a future with Anna depended entirely on his ability to claim his freedom. He could not marry as a slave. He could not raise a family as a slave. Their lives, if they were to be joined, required that he break the chains of bondage permanently. Throughout the summer of 1838, Frederick refined his plan. Every detail had to be perfect. A single error to wrong name, a suspicious glance, a missing signature could lead to arrest, torture, or being sold to the Deep South, where escape was nearly impossible. He had already experienced failure once, during the attempted group escape from Freeland's farm. He had no intention of failing again. The plan he designed was simple in theory, but extremely dangerous in execution. He would pose as a free black sailor traveling north. He would carry a sailor's protection certificate that he copied from memory. He would dress in sailor's clothing, provided by Anna. He would board a northbound train from Baltimore. He would sit calmly, speak confidently, and pray that the conductor did not question him too closely. From the train he would travel to Philadelphia, the free city. From Philadelphia he would continue to New York, guided only by faith and the promise of freedom. The night before his escape, Frederick barely slept. Every sound felt like danger. Every shadow seemed to move. If someone discovered his plan, if a neighbor grew suspicious, if a patroller stopped him, everything would collapse. His entire life hung on a single morning. On September 3, 1838, he left his workplace as if nothing were unusual. His sailor's clothes were hidden beneath his regular clothing. His forged pass was tucked securely inside his pocket. He walked through the streets of Baltimore with slow, steady steps, resisting the urge to run. At the station, the steam from the waiting train rose into the air like a signal of destiny. Frederick approached the boarding platform, his heart pounding so violently that he feared others might hear it. When the conductor approached, Frederick handed him the forged pass with a steady hand. He expected the conductor to study it, question him, or call for assistance. Instead, the man glanced quickly at the paper and nodded. "All right," he said, and moved on. At that moment, Frederick felt a wave of relief stronger than anything he had ever known, but he knew he was not safe yet. The train moved northward, passing through towns where slave catchers patrolled and where suspicion of black travelers was high. Every stop threatened exposure. Every new passenger was a potential danger. Still, Frederick remained composed, his eyes fixed on the passing fields and forests, silently counting the miles between him and slavery. When he reached Havre de Grace, Maryland, he had to transfer to a ferry that crossed the Susquehanna River. This was the most dangerous point. Many fugitives had been captured here. The ferry was crowded with travelers, and officials watched passengers closely. Frederick walked onto the ferry with purposeful steps, avoiding eye contact. No one challenged him. The moment the ferry reached the opposite shore of Pennsylvania, he felt his body lighten. He was still cautious, still alert, but the air itself seemed different. He was in a free state. But freedom was not yet secure. Slave catchers operated aggressively even in free states, and the fugitive slave laws allowed them to seize suspected escapees. Douglass continued traveling by train to Philadelphia, arriving exhausted but alive. In Philadelphia, he felt a powerful mixture of relief and fear. He was free but alone, penniless, and still in danger. From Philadelphia he traveled to New York City, where he met the well-known abolitionist David Ruggles, who protected and guided him. Through Ruggles, Frederick contacted Anna Murray. She immediately traveled to New York, and there, in a small safe house, they were married. Their union was not merely romantic, it symbolized Frederick's new identity, chosen freely and built upon courage and sacrifice. However, New York was filled with slave catchers. It was too risky to stay. With the help of abolitionists, Frederick and Anna moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a city known for its whaling industry and its strong abolitionist community. There, Frederick found work under a new name. He could not use his birth name because doing so might expose him. At the suggestion of a friend, he took the surname Douglass, inspired by a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem The Lady of the Lake. In New Bedford, Douglass experienced freedom fully for the first time. He earned wages and kept them. He moved where he wished, spoke to whom he wished, and spent his evenings reading, writing, and learning. His world expanded rapidly, not just through labor, but through thought. He began attending meetings of the abolitionist movement, listening to powerful speakers who denounced slavery and argued for justice. But the greatest transformation came when he himself was asked to speak publicly. In 1841, at a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, Douglass rose to share his experiences as a former slave. His voice trembled at first, but his words were clear and powerful. The audience was astonished. Here stood a young man who had escaped bondage, who had taught himself to read and write, who spoke with eloquence and conviction. His speech changed his life. From that moment, Frederick Douglass became not only a free man, but a leader to voice that would shape history. His path to freedom had been long, dangerous, and filled with suffering. But now, standing proudly before an audience that believed in justice, he understood a profound truth. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to a movement. It belonged to a nation struggling to define itself. It belonged to history. When Frederick Douglass stood before the audience of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society for the first time in 1841, he had no idea how profoundly that moment would change the course of his life. He had come to the meeting out of curiosity and admiration for the abolitionist cause. He expected only to listen. But when the speakers learned that a young black man in the crowd had escaped from slavery, they urged him to share his story. At first, he resisted. He feared that speaking too openly could expose his identity and attract slave catchers. But then, something inside him stirred with the same force that pushed him forward on the day he boarded the train to freedom. He stood, walked to the front, and faced the crowd. His voice shook at first, but as he described his childhood, The brutality of slavery, the whip of Edward Covey, and the desperate courage of his escape, his voice grew steady and strong. The room fell silent. People leaned forward, captivated by the clarity of his words and the vividness of his memories. When he finished, the applause was overwhelming. Men and women stood, astonished by both his eloquence and his presence. One abolitionist whispered, "We have found our man." This moment marked the beginning of Frederick Douglass' public life. He was soon offered a position as a lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. At first, he hesitated. He worried about leaving his new home in New Bedford. He feared that traveling across the North would expose him to danger. Yet he also knew he possessed something powerful, a voice that could reach those who had never seen slavery but needed to understand its cruelty. His life had given him a message, and his conscience urged him to deliver it. And so, Frederick Douglass became a traveling orator. In the early 1840s, he journeyed from town to town across New England, speaking at churches, meeting halls, and outdoor gatherings. Audiences listened with awe as he recounted the horrors he had witnessed. His speeches were detailed, measured, and filled with emotional truth. He spoke not with anger, but with moral clarity, a balance that made his message impossible to dismiss. Yet his success brought an unexpected challenge. Many white listeners doubted that a man who spoke so intelligently could ever have been a slave. They accused him of exaggeration. Some insisted that he was an impostor. Their disbelief revealed how deeply they misunderstood slavery and how determined they were to deny the full humanity of the enslaved. This disbelief pushed Douglass toward an important decision. If people doubted his authenticity, he would give them evidence. In 1845, just 4 years after escaping bondage, he published his memoir, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was a bold and dangerous act. The book contained names, dates, and locations that could easily lead slave catchers to him. But Douglass believed that truth was more important than safety. The book was released to wide acclaim. It revealed slavery with a clarity Americans had rarely seen, and it awakened the consciences of thousands. But with the book's publication came a crisis. Douglass had exposed his identity so completely that he was now vulnerable to capture. The fugitive slave laws allowed slaveholders to claim escaped slaves even in free states. Douglass knew that remaining in the United States could lead to his re-enslavement or death. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society urged him to flee temporarily to Europe, where he would be safe from American law. And so, in 1845, Frederick Douglass boarded a ship bound for Ireland and Great Britain. When he arrived in Dublin, he was stunned by the reception. He had expected curiosity, perhaps sympathy. Instead, he encountered overwhelming support. Crowds filled meeting halls. Newspapers praised his speeches. People who had never seen an enslaved person listened to his story with a seriousness that moved him deeply. In Ireland, he felt something he had almost never felt in America. He felt treated as a man, not as a color. He traveled through Ireland, Scotland, and England for nearly 2 years. During that time, he spoke to thousands of listeners, not political leaders, and helped expand the international movement against slavery. While in England, a group of supporters raised funds to legally purchase his freedom from Thomas Auld. They informed Douglass that he was now, in the eyes of the law, a free man. Douglass struggled with the morality of this act. He hated the idea of paying slaveholders. But he also recognized that freedom would allow him to continue his work openly in the United States without fear of capture. In 1847, as a legally free man, Frederick Douglass returned to America not to hide, but to lead. Upon his return, Douglass moved to Rochester, New York, where he founded an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. Its motto captured his belief in universal justice. Right is of no sex, a truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. The newspaper became one of the most influential anti-slavery publications in the country. Douglass used its pages to argue for abolition, women's rights, education, and equal citizenship. His writing was persuasive, thoughtful, and uncompromising. He challenged the hypocrisy of American democracy, which proclaimed liberty while enslaving millions. He demanded that the nation live up to its founding principles. During this time, Douglass worked closely with other leading abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. Though their methods sometimes differed, they shared a common purpose: to end slavery permanently. Douglass grew especially close to Tubman, whose courage in rescuing enslaved people through the Underground Railroad impressed him deeply. He called her one of the bravest persons on this continent. But Douglass' growing influence also brought new dangers. As the nation moved toward civil war, tensions over slavery intensified. Pro-slavery mobs attacked abolitionist meetings. Douglass himself was assaulted more than once. Still, he refused to be silenced. Each act of violence strengthened his resolve. In 1852, Douglass delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. What to the slave is the 4th of July? In it, he exposed the hypocrisy of celebrating freedom in a nation that still enslaved millions. His words were sharp, solemn, and devastating. The speech solidified his reputation as one of the greatest orators of his time. When the Civil War began in 1861, Douglass used his influence to push President Abraham Lincoln toward emancipation. He argued that the war could not be won without destroying the system of slavery. He insisted that black men must be allowed to fight for their own liberation. When the Union finally opened its ranks to black soldiers, Douglass helped recruit troops for the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments in American history. His sons, Lewis and Charles, joined the fight. Throughout the war, Douglass met with Lincoln multiple times. Their relationship was complex, sometimes tense, sometimes respectful. Douglass admired Lincoln's leadership but criticized his caution. Lincoln, in turn, respected Douglass' insight and moral force. After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, Douglass rejoiced, but he knew the struggle was far from over. True freedom required not only emancipation but equality. When the war ended in 1865 and slavery was finally abolished, Douglass celebrated the triumph, but he did not rest. He turned his energy toward Reconstruction, demanding civil rights, voting rights, and full citizenship for black Americans. He served as a federal marshal, a diplomat, and a public advocate. His speeches continued to move audiences well into old age. In the final decades of his life, Douglass remained a fierce advocate for justice, not only for African Americans but for women, immigrants, and oppressed people everywhere. His home in Washington, D.C., became a place of refuge, conversation, and activism. He continued writing, speaking, and inspiring new generations until the day he died in 1895. As he grew older, he often reflected on the journey that had brought him from a plantation in Maryland to the heart of American history. He knew that freedom had not been given to him, he had claimed it. He knew that dignity had not been granted, he had insisted on it. And he knew that the voice that now echoed across the nation had once trembled in fear on a plantation where he was denied even the knowledge of his own birthday. His life proved a simple, powerful truth. The human spirit, once awakened, can never be enslaved again. And so, the boy who once whispered the alphabet in secret, the young man who fought Edward Covey to reclaim his dignity, the fugitive who boarded a train in fear, became the man whose words would reshape the conscience of a nation. He had lived not only to free himself, but to show the world the meaning of freedom.